Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to make a quick announcement. Although the festivities were scheduled to start at 1 o'clock, we're going to give everybody a couple of extra minutes just to get in, get situated, get comfortable for our webinar today. So we'll probably launch in and around the 1:03 mark on the clock. Okay. So everybody just sit tight. Those of you that have just joined, appreciate your patience here. I made a quick public service announcement just to say a minute ago saying that we're going to wait until about the 1:03 mark on the clock before we get started. So just wondering why, if you're wondering why we're sitting here in silence looking at one another, that's why. So just appreciate your patience. Thank you. All right. Well, I said 1:03, we were going to get the party started. So it's 1:03 on the clock. And wanted to, first of all, start by welcoming everybody to our webinar today. This hopefully is the first of many to come. And wanted to just start with a couple of quick housekeeping items in addition to the welcome. First of all, we're hoping that folks have questions, and we would encourage you to submit questions throughout this session. Please don't wait until the very end. We do have people tracking what's coming into the chat, and while something is topical in your mind, please note your question and send it off. We are going to save questions, however, though, until the Q&A session, which will be at the end of our agenda for today. The other thing I wanted to mention is that your microphones will remain muted throughout the entirety of the session. And really the only ability that you'll have to communicate will be in the form of chat as a function of Teams. So just wanted to make sure everybody was clear on that. For those of you who don't know me, and a good many of you probably don't, although you may have seen my name and details in the invite and registration, my name is Paul Heineman. I'm a sales director here at Corio, and I'm thrilled to be your mediator for today. I've got 25 plus years in the realm of sales and customer advocacy. And when I think back throughout the entirety of my career, IT asset management was a huge and still remains a huge element of consideration for clients, whether they be in the small, medium business up through enterprise, public sector. It's really a function of the reality of IT, not so much a function of your segment. And, the great part about our time here today is that we've assembled kind of a crack squad of practitioners and professionals to help us through this panel discussion. First and foremost, I wanted to introduce George Roswell, who's a AVP at Manulife in the area of service-aware mapping, IT asset and configuration management. We have Mike Austin, who is the CEO and founder at Metrics Data 360. And last but not least, we have Steve Mifsud, who is our Chief Operating Officer here at Corio. Won't go into a deep dive on each of these gentlemen's CVs, but suffice it to say, a multitude of years of experience in and around ITAM, from a hardware, software, and from a industry best practices perspective. So that's why everybody got the invite today. So seeing as how the clock on the wall is moving, whether we are or not, let's get started, folks. Wanted to say a big thank you as well. As a part of the registration, we wanted to, kind of gauge the room, so to speak, and provide, I guess some insight from the group themselves. So in terms of, what are your biggest ITAM challenges? So if you take a look at what's on the screen, you can see from the chart that software and hardware management lead the list of challenges. Really isn't a surprise, I guess, if we think about it. These areas rely heavily on accuracy of data and ensuring that that data is indeed up to date, which, quite frankly, is a great jumping off point for our first topic today, which is data accuracy. And we view that really as the foundation of ITAM success. So above and beyond what we had in terms of the survey, wanted to also share a couple of data points, really just to kind of whet everybody's appetite in relation to data accuracy. We have a stat here from the Enterprise Strategy Group, ESG, that showed that approximately 28% of organizations through their asset management processes had inventory more than 75% complete. So roughly about a third of the organizations felt that their inventories were only 3/4 complete. So obviously a large margin of error across the entirety of those surveyed. In addition to that, I've got another little soundbite here from our friends at Forrester, where 51% of companies lose track of laptops and devices, leading to significant security concerns. Obviously, that's pretty intuitive, just looking at the size and scope and potential that organizations could face from a security perspective. So that really kind of sets the stage. So I'm going to turn to the panel now and say, gentlemen, what do you think about this? Mike, from your standpoint, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest challenge that most organizations face. So if you look at the problems that you started with in that pie chart, and lack of visibility, lack of understanding of what's deployed, all of those things start with data quality. And in the ideal world, organizations are trying to create a centralized repository for their software and their software inventory. Many organizations in the enterprise space are looking at, say, ServiceNow and utilizing the CMDB as that. The challenge is if you took and made something as simple as a Venn diagram that says, is it active? Is it active on the network? Is it active? Is it a physical device? In the cloud? It doesn't matter. Do we have a device out there, and do we have inventory? Right? In order to do things like pass software audits or be able to optimize your licensing costs, you need to have that simple Venn diagram at 90 to 95%. Now, people will ask me, why not 100? Because environments are dynamic. It's very near impossible to be 100%. But when we ask most organizations, when we start working with them, where do you sit? They all say 90 to 95%. We go in and do an assessment, and it's more like 60 to 65%. Now, I say it's a simple Venn diagram, but think about the ways and where people have to get this information from. You're lucky if it's one system. Some of our clients that we work with, we're stitching together from 75 different systems to create that Venn diagram, right? Wow. So the complexity that goes into that. And then when you take and go a step further and say, okay, how do we actually figure out licenses and things like that? There's attributes that are required, right? So if you think about what does it take to make, how do I license something? Is it by device? Is it by processor? Is it by core? Is it by user? User isn't an inventoriable thing. So how do I start pulling that all together? So if you look at like doing just a license position on, say, even something as simple as Microsoft Windows servers, and you have a few thousand servers, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of data points that you need to have at 90 to 95% accuracy, even to start to move forward. And that's where the challenges start. And unfortunately, in this industry, there are tool vendors out there like ServiceNow and their SAM Pro module, Flexera, and them that say, hey, install our stuff, and you can make these licensing positions. And people miss this fundamental step of making sure that their data is accurate before they go. most of the failed implementations start right there. So I think, that's a good place to maybe start off with, is just looking at, is it out there? Is it in our inventory system? And then what metrics do we need, or what attributes do we need to make license positions and move forward and start making, decisions on that? That to me is the basis. And the problem is most people skip that step completely when they start down this path.
Right. So it's a constant battle. And frankly, the notion of garbage in, garbage out really, holds true here, as it relates to that. Steve, George, I didn't know from one of you two had some added seasoning you wanted to bring to that.
Questions?
Yeah, I'll definitely jump in.
Go.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Steve. Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Mike mentioned. Great foundation. I agree with everything he mentioned. I'm going to tackle it from a different area, but also piggyback off of what Mike mentioned. So you have things like incident, problem, change management. We all know that they rely on the accurate data that's coming out of the CMDB and the AMDB asset management database, as I call it. There's a heavy reliance on the ITAM tool. So Mike mentioned your ServiceNow, your Flexera. Garbage in, garbage out. So when we look at these ITIL programs or processes, again, your change, incident, problem, they really rely on the accurate data that sits within ITAM or is coming out of the CMDB. They can't operate without that accurate data. They can't achieve that 95% without that 95% good quality data. So it's going to drive things like, it's going to increase your efficiency. Obviously, when you have your accurate data, you're going to spend less time, or your incident problem teams, et cetera, are going to spend less time trying to fiddle around and find out what the issue is. They go in, they look at the problem, they're gathering the information from the source tools coming out of the CMDB, and they're able to accurately assess and do the triage of that incident, whether it's a P1 to a P4. I would say it's also going to help drive improved decision making, right? So again, all of these assets, there's thousands in the organization. It's really going to centralize that data, improve your decision making to make quick, efficient decisions on that. One of the things we obviously overlook is service quality. So within IT, we're an internal service and we're delivering that service. So again, having that accurate data, whether you're supporting a cost center, a call center, an insurance team, or even if it's any internal business unit, having that data centralized and accurate is going to drive that efficient service quality. Reduce downtime and reduce costs. It's going to impact that. Again, when we think about incident, problem, and change, you imagine there's a war room. There's teams on the bridge, and they're trying to go through all these issues quickly. So you're going to create a faster resolution. It's going to help you to prioritize that issue a lot quicker. And then, a part of when you're, again, looking at incident, problem, and change, it's about how fast that communication goes out to the impacted teams. If an application's down, you want to get that up as fast as you can. So communicating that out to the teams is very important. So having that accurate data is going to hit all of these data points that I just described.
Okay, that's great. Steve, did you want to just take a quick
Sure. Yeah.
quick swing at that?
Sure, definitely. I'll add just a little bit here to this. And I think, looking at asset accuracy and how you keep it up to date and looking more from a hardware perspective, I think of different avenues, tying your request process to your asset repository to be able to automate and update your inventory as assets are being procured and assets are being offboarded, but also tying your asset inventory to critical changes in the organization. So employees left the organization or employees that are changing departments, and being able to track triggers based on those actions. And even above and beyond that, starting an attestation process. So leveraging the employees and the managers to actually attest of what they have beyond discovery and other sources of automated discovery of software and hardware titles.
Okay, that's great. I mean, and obviously this subject alone, I think we could probably have a webinar just on its own because there's a lot of elements to unpack there. So I appreciate, you guys being as brief as you could with a fairly significant subject. So just in the effort of keeping to the agenda here, wanted to kind of move on and looking at it from the perspective that, clearly data accuracy is really and truly the foundation. So knowing what you have, what you're using, and where you can optimize. And that really leads to, kind of the next element in our agenda, which is around how ITAM delivers true business value. One quick point, I guess, from Gartner, just as it relates to global enterprise software spending, they've got a projection that's going to reach 1.25 trillion by 2025, representing roughly a 14.2% increase from 2024. The interesting part is that kind of flies in the face of just about every mandate from an IT organization's perspective in terms of trying to curtail spending or to better control and maintain spending. So I guess the question I've got for the panel, and I'm glad it's you guys answering this and not me, but just, what are your thoughts in relation to that in terms of, talking about some of the pressures that IT faces, whether that's on return on investment or an overall cost control. George, what are your thoughts?
Great question. I think ITAM or IT asset management, it does play a crucial role in terms of driving your cost savings throughout the organization. And I think of two things. I think of rationalization and optimization when we look at assets as it goes through the life cycle journey. So first and foremost for me, I want to talk about the optimization of the assets. From my perspective, I think it helps drive or avoid redundancies, right? So eliminate that redundancy. It's going to help you to pinpoint and find your unused assets and really reallocate those efficiently. Secondly, it's going to talk about or help you have that discussion around your ability to reharvest, right? So reallocate, reharvest. A lot of companies are just on the purchase, procure process, and they don't have the ability to understand, Mike, you mentioned earlier, and Steve, you mentioned earlier, the fact that there's a limited visibility. Some people say they have 95%, but when you actually go in, it's really around 60. There's a lot of missing stolen devices. So you have to really have your eyes on the life cycle of the assets, where they are. And, as I talk about the reallocation, you have to have a process where at the end of the life cycle, you assess those assets, you pull information off, and you get them back into the environment, especially if they're not at the end of the life cycle. Procurement. Your procurement processes come into play here. So from a procurement best practice, you're going to have, I think, better purchasing power with more informed decisions on your assets. It's going to help you negotiate better. Mm-hmm. And I think the last thing from my perspective that may want to come up is it's often overlooked, but it shouldn't be overlooked. In this practice, you have to be prepared for any audits or reviews that come in. That's obviously an unexpected cost, a burden on your teams. So by having this visibility, you definitely don't want to have these additional costs of an audit if a third party comes in. So the visibility in your tools and assets is very crucial.
Okay. Now, we just kind of in keeping with the agenda here, Steve, maybe I'll get your perspective on that. We've got a couple minutes here for you and Mike to wade in.
Yeah. So organizations in a whole are always looking to save dollars in cost and increase productivity. And when you start to look within an organization, besides people cost and automation and AI capabilities, the next area of focus and low-hanging fruit to be able to save and generate savings is actually in asset management. Hardware and software asset management has tremendous opportunity for savings throughout an organization. Obviously, driving costs down helps fund other projects within IT so that they can, further achieve further savings and further efficiencies for their customers.
Excellent. And Mike, I'll give you the last word here. So beyond, cost savings, is there anywhere else that you want to take that?
Well, I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here. And what I mean by that is...
I thought you might. That's
Gartner's both our worst and best friend here, right?
Yeah.
So if you go to Gartner, they're going to tell you if you implement a SAM program, you can save 20 to 40% in year one, right? But the 20 to 40% is dependent on that first topic that we talked about around data quality. If you don't have good data, you're not going to save money. And in fact, if you don't have good data, you may be in the opposite situation. There's a stat out there, I can't remember who put it out there, but it said 50% of companies are both over licensed and under licensed, right? And that could be in the same publisher where I have way too many licenses of one thing for Microsoft and way too few of another, right? And so, when we're looking at these things and about delivering true business value, that I think that the problem with ITAM and SAM and HAM programs is that they almost want to operate like accountants. And Georgia and Steve have sort of hit on this a little bit, where it's like sort of this bottom up approach, like where are the assets, how do we track those assets? How do we track them to the user when they leave and move to departments? And that's important. But when you do that from a SAM perspective and a cost optimization perspective, you lose the opportunity to look at the whole because you're concerned with accounting for licenses in a department, right? And so you have to be able to look at it as a whole and kind of do this bottom up and bottom down approach. When you take one or the other, you miss out, right? And so is there an opportunity to deliver true business value with these programs? Absolutely. But you have to understand what are, one of the key things are like, what are the business's key objectives, right? So if you look across organizations today, a lot of them are saying, hey, we want to do better things with data. Well, what a great program you can put in if you really get visibility into how systems communicate and what hardware and software are associated with what applications and things like that, and tying to making better decisions in the business with data, right? But that's very tough for people that are wanting to count where assets sit to make those connections, right? But when you do this correctly, and when you get your data correctly and you get your metadata correctly and things like that, you can start to do things like look at, how much it actually costs to run that application. Are we selling it properly, to the market, right? Is our pricing correct? Are we actually making money on it? And so, yes, those things are possible. They take time, but they are possible. And I think that's where organizations need to start to look, because I go back to Gartner, 20 to 40%. How do you get 20 to 40% savings when Microsoft increased prices 11%? Broadcom, it's well known, VMware renewals are up 400%. Oracle's pumping up all their prices. SaaStr said that the average SaaS company put their price up 42% last year. So how do you save money when all of that's happening in market? You have to be able to optimize, right? And so, but you also have to look beyond just how do we save 40% to how do we actually provide value to the business in these programs. And George has hit on a couple of those things, in this conversation, of the things that you can do that go beyond. The challenge is articulating that up the chain to continue to get funding for programs like this, right?
Right. So it's a bit of a balancing act then between myopic focus and aggregate focus, so that you can take kind of a balanced approach across, the entire spend, if you will, to be able to take that forward. But I think it's also tempering expectations that Gartner brings around, 20 to 40% with a dose of reality. When you consider all of the contributing factors. So,
well, and I mean, can you get those savings? Yes, but where'd you set your budget, right? If you set your budget off of last year and you're coming into a Broadcom renewal at 300%, you're going to be upside down no matter what you do. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter how you do.
So you really have to,
sure,
and you can get proactive with that stuff as well, right? So.
No, for sure. For sure. Okay, great. Again, another subject that we could probably spend the whole time talking about. I appreciate the context, guys. Listen, I'm going to turn it to the participants here, the audience, and we're going to do our first poll question. So I'm going to ask everybody to kind of drill in here for, kind of 30 seconds, if you will. The question, while it's getting to the screen, and apologies, we may have some little bit of latency here materializing, but what's the biggest ITAM risk your organization faces? Please just pick one. There may be a few that apply, but I'd ask you to, put some critical thought forward in short order to select. And, we've got things like shadow IT with unauthorized software and hardware acquisitions, inaccurate or incomplete asset data, software license compliance and audit exposure, security vulnerabilities from unmanaged assets, and last but not least, ineffective lifecycle management, particularly as it relates to end of life or disposition. So I'll just give everybody a quick second here to respond, and we'll take a look at what the results are live, and then we'll keep rolling.
So, Paul, I can say like that lines very well with what we're saying. Like incomplete data, 42%, right? Like you got to start there. You can just see that in the results of the poll, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, you're seeing it before I'm seeing it on my screen.
Yeah.
So
It's in the chat. If you look in the chat, you can
Appreciate
actually see it updating live. The other
There
thing
you
that I would
go.
say as well, just as we're waiting for people to finish their vote here, is I think that there's a new shadow IT emerging, and that's Gen AI agents. Right? And I think that they're going to be a bigger problem than shadow IT, quite honestly, because they are not coming in traditionally through IT. They're coming in through the business, and how you find those things and manage them is going to be a huge challenge for the IT organization moving forward. But
Agreed. And one of the things, we recommend that organizations do is they need to address this up front and try to build some governance processes across the organization, and a process to actually capture this. As Mike mentioned, it's an unknown, and it's really going to impact organizations as we drive forward. Great thought, Mike.
Mhm.
No, that's great. All right. Well, appreciate everybody's taking the time to submit their response, and I think that's great. I mean, it certainly resonates with our agenda here today, and is kind of right in the wheelhouse of what we've been talking about. So, with that said, maybe let's shift gears a little bit. And one thing of interest that I noted in just kind of looking at the results, I somewhat expected that we might see some additional elements around security vulnerabilities, just because that's always very, very topical. But regardless of the outcome there, I think we had an opportunity to kind of speak to that. The notion of our third item on our agenda is ITAM as the risk management secret weapon. And I wanted to share a quick element from some survey results, and it's just coming up on screen here. So appreciate everybody's patience. It's actually something that highlights the fact that some 60% of respondents, albeit not today's respondents as a function of the poll question, said that IT asset information has the biggest impact on security and risk. So, as I said, although it didn't bear itself out in our poll question, I'm just wondering, guys, what's your take? And Steve, maybe I'll start with you from a risk and governance perspective.
Yeah, so obviously your asset accuracy, it all ties together and it all kind of feeds into your risk compliancy. And for an example I can give is, we were working with one organization who said they had a process around managing their assets for people who have left the organization. And, when we actually dove deeper into the information and started doing some data analysts, we actually found that there was quite a bit of individuals that left the organization and still had the assets that belonged to that organization with them. So that drives a risk because of information that resides on those laptops, the access that those laptops might have had, the software that was installed. That's a risk to the organization that can be mitigated by better asset accuracy. I'll leave it at that, Paul.
No, that's perfect, Steve. I appreciate that. George, I know that where you're coming from with Manulife, obviously there's a significant amount of regulatory compliance that you face day in and day out. So looking for your perspective on that.
Absolutely. I spent the last couple of years in the financial space, which are heavily regulated. So we deal with regulators across the globe, OSFI, et cetera. Steve is absolutely right. I love what Steve mentioned. It's really around the data on these assets, whether it's lost, missing, or stolen, and the ability to track, during the life cycle where these assets are going. A couple of things I'm going to sort of touch base on that come to mind for me. First and foremost, access control, right? So one of the things we see is without, governance and access controls in an organization, you're essentially leaving the door open for things like freeware, downloading software. Now, as simple as that sounds, that is a huge risk if you speak to your friends in InfoSec or on the cyber teams. Over the last couple of years, whether it's in the news or whether it's, across the organizations. There was a couple of alerts over the last couple of years where IT in general had to go in and remediate a lot of these items from security and vulnerabilities. The other thing I'll mention here within the industry is the amount of cyber attacks that come in for, not every institution, but things like, or institutions like banks, financials. We don't see everything that's happening from a cyber perspective because they're doing their job trying to protect the organization. But simple things like even, clicking an email. But where I'm going here is that there's lots of threats, attacks, vulnerabilities going on. And that all stems from the assets that are covered and monitored and measured throughout the life cycle in ITAM. We have, things like PII, which is the personal information. So I talked about OSFI. There's lots of governance that comes in. There's things like B10, B13, E13. I won't go into all the details, but those are different regulations that exist that are in place to protect organizations and to make sure that, as a financial institution, they're managing people's money, they're managing people's accounts. You have a lot of personal information that exists throughout the organization that resides on these assets. To Steve's point, if these are not managed properly, they're lost or stolen, you're at risk to the organization. Again, another example that comes to mind for me, I don't remember the name of the company nor would I mention it on this call, but it was in the news, and the theme was that they had decommissioned or retired, or at least they said they did. I would say they didn't decommission or retire, they disposed of these assets. And someone found these in a dumpster. And whoever went in pulled out the hard drives weren't wiped, degaussed, nothing. And there was a lot of personal information on those hard drives, and it got into the news. That turns into a reputational risk, a financial risk. You can get hit with PII, you can get hit with different fines. So it's often overlooked, but these regulatory and compliance, especially around access controls and just making sure that you wipe these assets with personal information or your business information, it's critical in today's environment.
No, that's key. And I do certainly remember, nor would I mention it, but I do remember it. In fact, I think there's a few that come to mind, whether it be landfill or a dumpster over the course of the last five to 7 years. So obviously a huge impact, in relation to that. Now, Mike, I know that the whole subject of software audits is a subject that's kind of near and dear to your heart as it relates to that. So I'm just curious, how does that kind of tie into this risk element?
I mean, I'll give you an example, not even talking about audit, but just risk in general, right? From a software perspective. And it sort of goes to something George spoke to, which is, freeware coming in and the security risk there. But there's also a business and compliance and financial risk, right? Because a lot of the software that's being brought in as freeware does not have commercial rights. Right. So in other words, you can't use it inside of a business.
Right.
According to the product use rights of that software. Right. And that extends not just to freeware coming in, but it also extends to think about, just the trends in the industry, moving from on-premise to public cloud. Sometimes those software contracts do not allow you to move that application to AWS or Azure or GCP. And companies are just moving them. Right, not knowing whether they can actually run the licenses that they have up there, or even run the software in those clouds. And there are some contracts that allow it, some that do not allow it, and some that don't even speak to it. Right, and so that's going to cause risk and challenges in the future. And we're starting to see that, right? Python's a great example of just that sort of software where it gets downloaded, everybody thinks it's free, and then they come knocking and going, hey, by the way, we saw your IP addresses, downloaded a bunch of our stuff, and that's not a free software. And all of a sudden they got 6-7 figures exposure and nobody even knew, right? And nobody was even watching, right? And so, that comes to the challenges of building out these teams, because you bring in a SAM team, they're focused on kind of what they're doing, and they don't even know about Python as a risk, right? To even proactively go out and say, hey, is this in our environment, or should it be in our environment, or should we even be concerned with it? And the thought of trying to look at, I always, when I'm doing these things, I'll say to a company, like, how big are you? How many software titles do you have? And they underestimate it by a factor of 50x every single time, right? Because when we go and pull inventory, we can show them how many publishers and titles and things that they have. And typically they say something like, oh, we have 200 to 300. I'm like, yeah, you got 5,000, right? Like, and they have no clue, right?
Massive.
Yeah. And then, obviously right into software audits and things like that, right? And that's a big challenge, because software audits typically, I always say software audits sort of go like this. They come in, and I'll use a big number, but I'm just going to represent what happens, whether it's 10 times this size or 1/10 the size, right? An auditor will come in, whether the publisher performs that audit or they have a third party like KPMG or Deloitte perform the audit. They're going to go through this whole process of getting all this data, providing them all this inventory, providing them license information, and then they get these things back called license positions. And they're showed that they owe $9 million, right? And I use 9 because it divides equally into a third, right? And typically what happens is a third of those findings right off the bat are due to poor data. They shouldn't even have been found, but they don't have data. Like in the Microsoft world, for instance, we do not know if that SQL Server is Express, free, standard, few $100, enterprise, tens of thousands of dollars. So the auditor is just going to assume the worst case scenario and assume it's Express. Or sorry, enterprise. Best case scenario is Express, right? But they'll assume it's enterprise. So a third of the findings in an audit are just poor data. And most of the time, organizations don't even know how to defend against that, or even what was poor with the data to do that. A third of the audit was just bad assumptions or gray areas in licensing, right? And that's simple things like, we didn't have a proper naming convention for all our dev and test environments. So, now all of a sudden some stuff that is dev and, pre-production that can use cheaper licenses have been assigned, more expensive licenses. Right. Or, hey, you were licensing your environment with processors. So we put processors across the whole environment when that division or that department actually is better on a named user model or whatever it is. So it's just poor, assumptions, kind of gray areas in licensing. And then the final third is probably what you were naturally supposed to do as a true up via growth. Right. But what ends up happening is this $9 million finding that we end up fighting over for months, when the only thing we should be focusing on that audit is that middle third. Because the first third should be gone. The middle third should be like, yep, we owe you that because it was, growth, and we can show you that was growth, and that's just, we'll pay you at the anniversary date of our contract. It's the third in the middle that we believe we don't owe for whatever reason, and then you should be fighting on that. Right? But most organizations are fighting on the whole 9 million and not even know. And then they're like, the vendor's like, hey, you owe us all this money. And then it becomes this whole, we'll buy all this stuff you don't need and we'll let it go away. And how it goes from there, right? So,
yeah. And you're locked in. I got an idea. Let's make it more complex for you to manage for next time when we come back for another audit. So certainly see, and sorry, George, certainly see how it builds on itself and easily exacerbates because of lack of data clarity and frankly, the fact that there are all these, different kind of gaping wounds seemingly that happen in that environment. Sorry, George, I'll give the last word to you and then we'll move on.
No, I was really echoing what Mike said. I think he covered quite a few but important points. You can't overestimate or underestimate the impact of your SAM team and your HAM team. Simple things like, in the example Mike just gave, I would recommend partnering with your procurement teams and your vendor management teams to make sure that you're aware of what contracts exist, whether it's new or existing contracts. Mike touched on some points around usage. MSDN and development licenses is a huge issue. So definitely piggyback on what Mike just said, because that is I would say that should resonate with everybody on this call and everybody in any organization. That is by far one of the biggest risks and opportunities to address.
For sure. All right. Well, that's great. Great conversation, guys. I appreciate it. We'll keep rolling here into our next subject, which I've got common ITAM pitfalls and lessons from the trenches. So definitely, there's a number of different pitfalls that we've talked about, whether that be in relation to audit or data quality or what have you. But Steve, maybe I'll start with you. who from a responsibility perspective around maybe asset ownership or those types of things, where do you kind of, draw that line?
Yeah, I can go on forever, Paul. We probably have a whole webinar just on this thing alone. I think one of the biggest misconceptions by organizations and IT asset managers is the differences between the CMDB and the asset repository. Obviously, to have a holistic and a successful ITAM program, you need to have both scenarios in place. You need a proper CMDB with your CIs and your discovery data and all that information, but you need an asset repository of what you procured, what you're entitled to, and a reconciliation between the two systems is critical to a successful ITAM program. That's one of the top pitfalls that I see. The other is that lack of ownership, of not assigning proper ownership for all assets to individuals, either through having a proper owner defined. So when you got to go out and hunt for that asset, or someone who's responsible for that asset, you have that owner defined and being able to find that.
Okay, great. No, and I think that's key, because at the end of the day, that notion of ownership and the correlation between CMDB and asset repository is critical in terms of sorting it out, frankly, when it comes down to that, whether that's a function of audit or any of the other potential ramifications that we've talked about. George, what are your thoughts?
Life cycle mismanagement.
Okay, fair.
I think organizations really need to perfect, and again, it seems like it's simple, but you really have to perfect your process to effectively manage your assets throughout the life cycle, whether it's hardware or software. We've seen examples of organizations not cutting change records. We talked about the impact of the CMDB, the configuration management database. I won't get into all the things around discovery, but the ability to cut IT changes really showcases, and it really simplifies and authenticates that an asset has transitioned through the life cycle and it's in its current state. There's been tasks assigned. I can talk about things like decommission. We've seen examples, and I've used to work for one of the big three. So I actually used to go in and do some reviews and audits of organizations, and we've seen examples of simple things like an asset not being retired. So it's labeled as retired because someone says it is, or it says so on your Excel sheet, and the CMDB or discovery says it's not, and you have to do that reconciliation. Then comes the fact that, as I talked about before, there's an incident on that server. Is it really decommissioned? That's going to extend that time. It's going to lead to more troubleshooting on that server. Maybe it's a bank application, and online banking goes down. If you're looking at whether it's the application or a server that it's dependent on, and it says it's retired, you're going to go look at something else because you have to quickly get that online banking system back up. So life cycle management is huge. I've seen examples of organizations where, again, they've said these assets have been decommissioned and they're still attached to the network. You get the IT team or the SAM team to go ping the asset, and it's pinging away. It's still there, but the folks in IT are saying it's been decommissioned.
Right. No, for sure. And having a tight process, it's not just the people and the technology, but the process that goes with it to help make sure. So certainly can see how, and again, in dynamic environments, how easily that could get missed or be misunderstood in terms of the true status of those assets. Mike, what's your take as it relates to the pitfalls that you see?
I'm going to piggyback off George here for a quick second, and then I'll give a couple of other ones, right? And what organizations don't understand is the cost that is associated with what George just talked about. I literally had a conversation last week with a client of ours where we had to explain to them that they had some massive true-ups for Microsoft licenses, and that they could get rid of it all by just actually decommissioning the servers that they said had been decommissioned for a year that were still sitting with licenses. And this was 7 figures, mid 7 figures of Windows and SQL Server licensing. And so, so it doesn't matter the size of the organization. I always tell people, like, that's a 100,000 person company. 7 million is a big number. You take that to 1,000 person company, make it 70,000. It's still relevant to their budget how much money they're wasting on things like this. And that was just us looking at that for it, right? If you take and extrapolate that out on management tools, other vendors like Oracle databases or things like that were sitting on there, it was probably tens of millions of dollars of stuff just because they haven't actually gone through the decommissioning process. And when they say things like, we don't have the time and or resources to actually do it, it's like, well, that's costing you $7 million. I'm sure you can hire, a college student or something to go through and decommission, get those things off the network, right? Like given the process that they follow it, right? So I think that's a key point. But I would add three things. Again, another thing that kind of piggybacks off of George a little bit, but ITAM is a team sport and it's a contact sport, really, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, so what I mean by that is this is not an IT problem. It's not a SAM problem. It's not a HAM team problem. It's not an ITAM team problem. It is purchasing, finance, IT, ITAM, vendor
It's all
management.
interrelated.
It's all correlated. And a lot of the times the problem is it's done in isolation by one or the other.
Right.
Or one of the others, right?
Right.
So a lot of the times we'll see ITAM's doing one thing completely contradictory to what procurement's doing, or that ITAM's doing something, but the business is planning on getting rid of that vendor and they've just wasted thousands of hours trying to do something specific to that, right? So it is definitely a team, and you need to have your teams and make sure that they're aligned. The other thing that I would say is that there's a lot of set and forget mentality, particularly in the software side of this. And so what I mean by that is typically licenses are bought as part of a project, and the hardware that was bought with that project. They're bought, they're assigned, and they're forgotten. Right. And even when you have a SAM tool in place, the SAM tool does a reconciliation, goes out, hey, that thing's licensed and it's compliant. It doesn't necessarily go, that thing's licensed, but you're wasting a crap ton of licenses because how you're using it is not the same way you were using it 4 years ago. Right. And I can give you a real world example. We had a client that had some IBM product. They were licensing all on PVUs. They were actually short PVUs, but when we looked at it and said, okay, you guys are doing this set and forget, everything's on PVUs, therefore you need like 8,000 PVUs or whatever it was. When we said, let's step back and look at what you're doing, we were able to find that their dev environment was better off on user licenses. So we take a $2 million compliance gap to a $5,000 purchase to solve it.
Wow.
Right. But you have to step back and look at that and get out of that set and forget mentality that this is the way that we've always done it. It's like, how else can you do it? Right. You need to be asking yourself those questions. And I think the third thing is managing the wrong things.
Sure.
Right. And what I mean by that is there's a lot there. But if I simplify kind of to what this conversation has been today, I go into a lot of organizations and like they're doing things with CIs and things like that in the CMDB. And you're like, why are you doing that? And it's like, we've always done it. And I'm like, what's the value out of doing that today? And it's, pin drops,
Yeah,
right? So it's
sure.
like making sure that you're managing the right things. You're looking at the right data that you need to be looking at in order to make these decisions. And also, if I go back to that PVU example, looking at the data that you need that you're not even looking at in order to make an informed decision to do optimization, right? But the other side of that is the KPIs that come along with this. Right? What are we actually managing from a KPI perspective to look at how effective is the program, right? Number one is always savings, but define savings, right? If Broadcom was going to be a 400% increase and Sam came in and said, hey, we can optimize our clusters and how we're configuring things and get that to a 200% savings or 200% increase from 400% because we decrease the number of cores that we need. Is that a savings? Is that soft savings?
The cost or cost
Where's
avoidance.
the cost avoidance, right? And those things are all treated differently. But the reality is, if the SAM team didn't do that, the CIO was going to cut a check for two times what they were going to. But then they go, well, that's not savings, and we didn't hit our 40% savings because it's cost avoidance, right? So you have to make sure you're measuring the right things. But it's also what else are you measuring, right? Is it compliance? Is it how quickly we can go through an audit? Is it how quickly we can get data to our end users that need it, right, to make decisions? So I think what measuring the right things is something that needs to be thought through as well. So
No, and that's, totally agree with that. And, again, we could probably unpack each of these subjects into its own webinar series, because there's lots of considerations and frankly, lots of things, that can be driven. I think just in the interest of time here, we're going to kind of jump forward a little bit and we're going to talk about quick wins. I'm going to call this the speed round. I'm going to give each of you gentlemen, kind of 30 seconds, just from the perspective of, when you think about it, often the most impactful changes can come from, simple, very targeted actions, right? Those kind of quick wins. So I'm interested if you could take, say 30 seconds each to kind of think, okay, if I had to do one thing or two things, kind of what would those things be? So you don't have to elaborate, but just, give me kind of a quick, hey, these are the things that I'd focus on, 1, 2, boom.
I'll go first. That's data quality.
Okay.
First and foremost, I would get our data quality up at 95%. And I'd want to understand what that actually means as well, right?
Okay.
The second thing that I do, I give everybody something very tactical that they can do. Log into your M365 portal, have your admin go in there, look at the number of blocked users that have licenses assigned to them and reclaim them and get rid of them on your anniversary date. That is costing you 7 to 8% of your Microsoft licensing cost right off the bat. And it doesn't matter what organization you are, we see that across the board. So there's something very tactical everybody can do today. Just, have somebody log into the admin portal, look for blocked users, find the license they're assigned to them and get them removed, and pull back 5 to 7% of what their M365 spend is.
That's the one to grow on, everybody. Appreciate that, Mike. And there you go. It's quick and easy, and 7 to 8% right there. George, what are your thoughts on the speed round?
Love what Mike said. Keeping in the theme of the speed round, Azure as well. Get into the portal, take a look at your resources, make sure that your utilization is where it should be, and you're right sizing appropriately. Bring those costs down. Secondly, for me, I think we talked about it before, but I call it really the taxonomy of your assets. So label your assets in terms of it's a DR, hot, cold, warm, that impacts your licensing, prod, dev. Again, simple things that we overlook, making sure you have a unique taxonomy so that when Sam or your IT teams look at this stuff, you're able to effectively clean it up.
Nomenclature is key. So that's a great tip, George. And Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, manage your assets to your employees. As employees leave the organization, follow those assets. Obviously, critical that the assets are assigned to the owner's property as my previous point. Second is tie your asset management process to your procurement team. Your procurement tools and process. Without that information, you have no visibility to what's being purchased or what you're entitled to. And last, asset management is truly a three-pronged approach. It's people, process, and technology. Not two of the three, and not one of the three for sure. But it really takes all three to be able to have an ITAM successful program.
Yeah. I'm going to add to what Steve just said, and it's not a third. And the biggest one of them is not technology. So we'll leave it at that. You can pick whether it's people or process, but it's not technology.
No, that's totally fair. All right. So just keeping things moving forward here. Again, lots of great discussion. But we're going to jump to the Q&A part of the session, and we've actually got some great questions that have come in from our audience. I had a couple that I was going to draw on, but let's go with some of what's coming in from the crowd. So first and foremost, is it shadow IT or is it actually citizen development? What are our thoughts on that in a quick synopsis?
I'm not sure what they mean by citizen development, so I can't answer that one personally.
All right. Well, there may be, based on that, unless George or Steve want to take a run at it. Maybe I'll jump to the next question that we got in. What are some of the unique data quality hurdles that organizations face when managing software assets?
Go ahead.
I could start if you guys want.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
I think if you go back, first off, is everything within is everything inventoried in whatever system it should be? CMDB, asset database, is it all there? That I think that's the most fundamental one. And it's not just is it inventory, but then do we have everything that we need, right? So if you look at it, it's one thing to know that we have inventory on 10,000 servers, but if we don't have processor and core counts on, 2,000 of them, that becomes a problem, right? It's also looking at what sources of information, because one system might say, hey, that's a 2 processor, 16 cores. Another might say it's 64 cores. So figuring out what the highest truth is. Understanding what we need to be looking at, understanding what is not inventory but is required, right? So user information, for instance, right, is not something that's in inventory, it's in other systems. Relying on the quality of those other systems, right? Can we really rely on the HR systems for headcount, things like that? Then starting to look beyond that into the things that allow you to make really good business decisions, right? Job codes, location codes, things like that, so that we can then start to benchmark, right? So I can give you an example of where this comes to play, right? We work with a hospital organization. They own multiple hospitals in the US. And you got a hospital that's spending $150 a month on Microsoft and another one that's spending $50. Right? The initial thought is to go right to the $150 one. Why are you spending so much? But when you have the right data, you can go in and see that the $50 one's actually spending $300 a month for the same functionality the other one's spending $150 on. So now we can start benchmarking and saying, okay, you can get rid of $250 worth of other stuff that this peer of yours is doing with Microsoft. Let's start working at that to decrease our overall IT costs, right? So that's how it all starts to come together. But it's there is no silver bullet to data, and getting to that 95% is very challenging and very tough, but you have to take it step by step. Do we have inventory? Do we have the attributes? What attributes do we need? Do we have the right ones? Do we trust those sources? And then you just keep working through it until you get to that 90 to 95%. Now, you could be 95% on one vendor and 20% on another, right? Because it's different attributes, different ways of counting, et cetera. So it's a continuous process to continue to get there, right? So.
Right. Steve, did you want to weigh in
I
on
was
that
just
as
going
well?
to add one thing there, Paul.
Sure.
I think as organizations start to look at software asset management, I think the biggest challenge is, understanding what they are entitled to, what they've purchased, what they procured. I made reference to a procurement, playing along with your procurement team. But I think it also ties into the previous question around shadow IT, where organizations are going out and purchasing software on credit cards and all that, and not having that visibility, which impacts your ability to have a viable software program.
George, did you want to take a quick?
Yes, I agree with what Steve and Mike said. The other thing I would add simply is that as we look at things like an effective license position, we often find that the SAM team should be the expert. So we know the licensing, we know the usage and the terms. The technology teams, they're just deploying. So you often find a discrepancy between, whether it's processor versus named user. They don't understand, and they'll just go license things. And there's a point where they're going to contradict your findings.
Yeah.
I think the thing is to stand true to what you're saying, and you have to be able to communicate to them to help them understand that, yes, you're mislicensed and here's the impact.
Right.
Yeah. I would summarize that as for that is the IT teams need to stop thinking that their software vendors are their best friends.
Yeah.
Right. And taking everything that they say to them on how they need to buy with a grain of salt instead of just trusting it blindly.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, listen, I hate to wrap this party up early or unnecessarily, but just in respect of everybody else's time, we've covered a lot of ground today in terms of whether we're looking at data accuracy, or whether we're talking about business value to ITAM's role in risk management. We've touched on some common pitfalls to avoid and shared some practical quick wins. So, frankly, you can start implementing things right away. I wanted to extend a big thank you to each of our panelists today. So George, Mike, Steve, appreciate you all, sharing your insights with the group. And obviously want to have you all back again for another lively discussion. A couple of housekeeping related matters. First and foremost, identified as a part of the registration that we were going to select a few attendees to receive Amazon gift cards. We will be following up with an email relative to that to announce the winners. And we also have had a number of questions that were put into the chat. So just wanted to apologize that we didn't get a chance to address all of them. Excuse me, but as a function of the follow-up, we are going to provide responses back and some context from each of the panel folks to be able to give you some perspective on what's there. Last but not least, as it relates to housekeeping, we are going to be introducing a special limited time offer around data quality assessment for your consideration. That too will be coming out as a function of our follow-up email. And the one thing I guess I did want to say is, and I kind of led with this off the top, we're hoping that this is the first of many to come. In fact, we're kind of trying to assess at what interval we'll look at doing this right now based on, how much content there is and frankly, the response to our first attempt at the webinar series. We're probably going to look at doing something in the month of April. So obviously would love to have everybody back for a follow-on discussion. If there are certain topics that you'd like us to put to the panel, whether it's this panel or a slightly modified panel, would be happy to take your feedback or input around that. And once again, whether that's CMDB alignment, whether that's SaaS asset management or automation strategies, we're happy to tackle it all. As I said, we know some of the best and brightest and want to keep this thing going. So just in the interest of time, as I said, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you again real soon. Have a look for our correspondence, and again, appreciate your participation and your attendance. Hope you have a great rest of day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.